I'm really thrilled to kind of end this conversation, although we'll have time for questions and answer and discussion. But the last presentation is really back to the desert and the crossroads of the Silk Road. The Belton Road Initiative, I think many people are somewhat confused. The roads actually refers to the first half of our morning, which was the Southeast Asian connections and the South Indian Ocean. The belt is actually the old Silk Roads, the ancient Silk Roads. It's a difficult kind of conception, but sometimes things are lost in translation, as everyone knows. You can see in the right-hand corner of your screen a moving map of this region, which we normally refer to in English and in Chinese as Xinjiang, which means new region. However, the Uyghur, who are autochthonous to this region, they prefer the term Eastern Turkestan, and this ancient map actually shows that it was recognized that way internationally in the past. But it's been a problematic region for China, partly because of the Muslim presence, but many other reasons. I think it has to do with the history of the region, the complicated past that it has, but the large population of Muslims that are concentrated not just in Eastern Turkestan, but also Central Asia, has been problematic for external rulers, whether Russian, Chinese, Western, South Asian, British, for not just centuries, but millennia, as we know. I, as an anthropologist, spent a lot of time in this area known as Xinjiang, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. But I started my work originally in north central China in the Hui Muslim Autonomous Region known as Ningxia or Yinchuan, beginning as Clay mentioned in Beijing and at Beida, and then moving west along the ancient Silk Roads. The farther I got, the more people said, keep going west, young man. If you want to understand what's going on here, you have to keep going. And I ended up in Istanbul and I said, I'll just stay here for a while. But basically, I think a lot of you may have seen this very important article in the New Yorker that chronicled a Kazakh woman's experience of having been born in this region, and basically talking about how she has been subjected to almost inhuman treatment by the Chinese authorities and their carceral system of what they call the re-education centers, what scholars have begun to call concentration camps, re-education camps. I recommend this article. There's been some reactions to it. One critic has been Jim Millward at Georgetown, which suggests that the article seems to come out against separatism as kind of the culprit in all of this, and even perhaps terrorism on behalf of the Uyghurs. And I think Jim Millward, who has written extensively on the region as well, also has worked in Russian and Chinese, and is much more of a historian and a long-term longue durée approach to these problems than I have as an anthropologist, basically arguing that we have to put this in context and realize that separatism is not necessarily bad, as we Americans discovered 300 years ago. And we, as Americans, do not always intervene in any other people's problems with separatism or terrorism. So why is it that this article seems to suggest that the US, this is not our issue. However, with our commitments to human rights around the globe, we should be concerned and we should be engaged, but almost trying to suggest that there is some merit to the approach the Chinese are using in this region to address this problem. Now, I tried to write about this courtesy of the Hoover Institute, with whom I worked in the past, but not an institute that I've generally supported in terms of their more conservative approach to the Sino-US problem. But in this article, which I wrote, seems a while ago now, to address this this policy of the re-education centers in Xinjiang, I suggested back then that it was really the Belton Road Initiative that was behind a lot of these policies. And I recommend it to you. I think it's in your packet. But basically addressing that what we're seeing in the headlines is only basically one aspect of this enormous project, and it's mostly focused on development. Now, the kind of penultimate exclamation point to U.S. policy in the region was on his last day of office. Some of you noticed that Secretary Pompeo initiated a policy in the U.S. of declaring this a human rights dilemma, and that it determined that China was in violation of its own signatory participation on the United Nations Declaration against these kinds of policies of genocide, ethnic genocide. And this has caused a huge stir. Interestingly enough, Secretary Blinken and the Biden administration does not walk this back. And we found out that in Alaska, they're still continuing with this policy. And it does underscore the US commitment to the region and also concern about China's policy in the region. What I'm going to try to do is put this into context. I mentioned the area has a large Muslim population. By China's entire population, it's not enormous, but by world Muslim population, it is large and mostly Sunni. The light green on your screen, the map, are predominantly Sunni. There are some Shiites in China represented by the dark green in your map. But as we know in China, mostly the vast majority of its 24 million Muslims are Sunni. Now, I say that 24 million because it's an important number. It puts China up in the top 10 or 11 of Muslim countries in the world, certainly eclipsed by Southeast Asia. And I think that's why the Southeast Asia piece of this BRI puzzle is so critical, because here China again is working with and through Muslim majority regions. China's Muslim population is spread out, but it is concentrated in the Northwest, and it's larger than many Middle Eastern Muslim populations, which I think people tend to forget when we think of the US engagement in the Middle East and the importance of Saudi Arabia, Mecca for the world's Muslims who look towards Mecca as a pilgrimage city. And I think it's important to remember that China also is a Muslim country, a Muslim minority country. And the question is, how did those Muslims get into China? Well, you really need to flip that coin and say, how did China get out to those Muslim regions? Because as we know, as historians of China, China traditionally was not interested in those Western regions or Southeast Asian regions. It was always concentrated in the North China Plain, the heartland of Chinese people and civilization. It's really thanks to the Mongols that China was included in a much larger empire that included large populations of Central Asians, many of whom who were converting and later converted to Islam, including the Mongols. A large proportion did convert, particularly the ones that settled in China. So it's this Mongol domination of China that brought Muslims into China, not only as populations and as settlements, but also for administrative purposes. Because the Mongols didn't trust the Chinese, as all colonial empires discover. The dominated population, the subalterns, if you will, to take a term from my last book, basically are not to be trusted. They're to be kept under the thumb of the colonial authorities, often via the use of mediators. Just look to the British example of the Raj in India as an example of that. So basically, the Mongol administration was critical to this project of integration of China into a much larger Eurasian empire. And so this importance of the Mongols was critical. And look at what the Mongols accomplished in terms of their infrastructural development. We don't think of the Mongols as engineers, but of course the great cities of Central Asia were built later under Mongol rule, and also the roads, the Silk Roads, that had developed in the Han Dynasty with trade between the Han Empire and Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire. But don't forget, there were never any Roman coins circulating in China. Basically, there were a lot of intermediaries between, and the region has never been integrated in the same way as it was under the Mongols and their domination. So it's these Silk Roads overland, but also remember there were maritime connections at the time. Marco Polo traveled to China along those maritime routes and returned to Venice. He was a seafarer, the maritime trader from Italy. Now, the Uyghurs claim, and they have good historical evidence suggests that they've had connections and populations under the Uyghurs in this Central Eurasian region, today known as Xinjiang, then known as Eastern Turkestan, and various names. They were the mediators that helped bring Buddhism into China prior to them accepting Islam. Now, if we look at the Great Uyghur Empire, which flourished about the same time as the Tang Dynasty, 6th to 9th century, we know that the Uyghurs were a community of Turkic, Altaic, nomadic peoples that settled very early and began farming and began engaging in agriculture like the Tang peoples to their south. Now, once they engaged in that, they began to engage in trade with the Tang and the other Turco-nomadic empires and peoples that surrounded them. And it was this trade that was a source of rivalry, but also great profit for not only the Mongols, who were preceded by the Uyghurs, but also the Tibetans, whose empire flourished, and of course, the great Tang Dynasty, a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious dynasty, as we all know. Anybody who's been to Xi'an, the ancient capital of Chang'an, has seen the sort of remnants of this great multicultural, multilingual, multi-religious empire known as the Tang. Now, the Uyghurs were defeated by another Turco-nomadic group, a tribal confederation today, and then known as the Kyrgyz. This pushed them south into where they'd had trading relationships, but also some extensive military ability to conquer and occupy the oases around this great depression known as the Taklamakan Desert. So as they moved south into traditional Chinese domains, they displaced a lot of the populations and reestablished a Uyghur kingdom in the oasis cities around the Taklamakan. And it's these important oasis cities that yielded the great histories of the Uyghurs that we have found today through unearthing the famous Taklamakan mummies. These are naturally preserved corpses that give credence to the Uyghur claims of autochthonous or indigenous claims to this land. Basically, there's even some thinking that there might have been trans-Eurasian connections between the Uyghurs, the early Uyghurs, and those groups of nomadic peoples who wandered and moved back and forth to Europe, and even perhaps a connection to the ancient Celts. Now, as Islam expands into this area, we find that you see this little bulge in your screen, that's Kashgar. And this is where Islam very early establishes a foothold. By the 9th century, most of Central Asia and the Mediterranean, the littoral coasts of the Mediterranean, are converted and occupied by Muslim dynasties. China, possibly because of Buddhism, but also because of the strength of the Chinese dynasties, resisted the spread of Islam for about 5 more centuries. So for about 400 years, there were Uyghurs here in the middle of these regions who were still Buddhist, and some gradually converting to Islam. And there were a lot of tensions over this gradual conversion. In places like Hami, we found Uyghurs as late as the 15th and 16th century who were still Buddhist. So there were a lot of, it was a gradual spread. By the 16th century, this entire region has converted to Islam, and China, as I said, had very, very limited rule or contact over a lot of these regions. Now, it was the late Joseph Fletcher at Harvard University who first suggested that the modern day Uyghurs, who trace their origins to this great Uyghur kingdom, basically for 500 years stopped referring to themselves as Uyghurs because they'd converted to Islam. Now, one of, I think, the great contributions and insights of the Prophet Muhammad was that he made his religious tradition, his new religious tradition, open to all, and was critical to tribal and ethnic differences. Remember, the community in Medina was welcoming to Jews and non-Muslims, non-people of the book. So this kind of traditionalist Islam pervaded, so that when Uyghurs gradually converted to Islam, they didn't want to be known as Uyghurs. They wanted to be known as Muslims. They wanted to leave their tribal and ethnic and linguistic differences and join the great Ummah, the great community of Muslims, which was a global trans-Silk Road, trans-Eurasian religion. So as entering into this great tradition, it was for 400 or 500 years that you rarely saw in any manuscripts the name for the Uyghurs. Not that they no longer existed. It's just that they foregrounded their religious traditions and conversion to Islam, which, as Malcolm X discovered, was antithetical to divisions along tribal, ethnic, racial identities. And I think this is what led Islam to spread so rapidly across the ancient Silk Roads and throughout the Mediterranean. So it's really Joseph Fletcher's theory that inspired me to really think about, well, how did they begin to develop as a people out of this Buddhist tradition into an Islamic community, and today into the Uyghurs? And I think it's a really important point to remember that this region, these borders and boundaries have never been that fixed. We have a nomadic tradition, we have a Central Asian tradition, and it's later nationalism and the rise of the nation state that basically begins to divide this region into originally the five peoples, a term that Sun Yat-sen and the early nationalists borrowed from Western and Soviet thinking, modern thinking about national identities. In fact, it was Sun Yat-sen who said the Chinese never had a sense of nationalism, of nation. They had a sense of family, of jia, of lineage, zu xian. So they didn't really think of themselves as a nation. But in order to resist the West, and a lot of early Chinese nationalists like Liang Qichao, Kang Youwei were very much against this Western import of nationalism. But it was Sun Yat-sen and others who realized by his term abroad in Hawaii, and also in Japan and in Canton under Hong Kong British rule, that he realized the power of nationalism for uniting a diverse people, and also the need to have a seat at the table in the growing rise of nation states and their powerful militaries. So it was this Western imported policy, just like what other Western imports, like science and ideas of religion, that inspired these early Chinese nationalists to try to overcome their differences with conquest dynasties like the Manchu, the Qing dynasty, to unite China under a new thinking, an idea of majority minority, a majority national group and a minority community, all of these other groups that China as a nation would attempt to include and administer. I think of the Han for China as somewhat like the category whiteness. We've been thinking a lot about that category in the last recent decade on the rise of white nationalism in the United States. It's something that's begun to dominate a lot of discourse. Well, Han, like whiteness, is a product of modern thinking about race, Western thinkings about race and theories, pseudo-scientific thinking, if you will, about race, but also, I think more importantly, ideas about nationalism. Who's going to define the majority? Who is going to be excluded or administered as a minority? And how are those categories constructed? Well, in China, the communists, after they took over, won the civil war with the nationalists, they established a similar policy of means of nationality and divided all those minorities into 55 groups, not just 4 minority groups, but kept the idea of a Han majority. And as I've tried to suggest in my writings, that it's this constructed category of Hanness that leads to contemporary thinking about so-called minority identity. You don't find the term indigenous or autochthonous very much in Chinese literature about these multi-ethnic peoples that comprise China in the past and today. You see this term Minzu or Shaoshuminzu, minority nationalities. And I think it's this idea, which wasn't important. China never thought of its peoples that way. Remember, most of China was always united by conquest dynasties, Mongols and Manchus. So the incorporation of minorities was in a very, or different, non-dominated dominating peoples was very much a constructed and a modern way of thinking. It was what Ben Anderson called stretching the tight skin of the nation over this gigantic body of the empire. And I think it was Lucian Pye who said it even better, that China is an empire trying to be a nation. And I think we still see these imperial legacies today in its contemporary treatment of its minority populations, such as the Uyghur, who are not easily integrated into Chinese society. Now, interestingly enough, these minority populations are growing. So it's not as if they're exterminating them. And I think this is why Chinese think that this label of genocide is very offensive, very inappropriate, because the reality is that minority populations, including the Uyghur, are growing. But I think many thoughtful individuals are writing about this, saying, well, it may not be a kind of ethnic genocide in this that you're trying to exterminate a population. It's more of a cultural genocide, and that you're trying to exterminate their culture and erase their histories and language and religion. And that's what I think people find most objectionable and most problematic. Now, I'm worried about our time, so I'm going to go very quickly. I want to first talk about the Hui, the Kazakhs, and then the Uyghur, basically because they're the three largest populations of Muslims in China, and also I think critical for understanding what's going on in Xinjiang today. These populations are large. There are other smaller groups of Muslims in China that we won't have time to talk about, but perhaps we can address in the questions. I mentioned there are a few Shiites in China. They're almost all among this small population, about 40,000 of the Tajiks, but they're not 12er Shiites as we see in Iran. They are Ismailis, and not affiliate as you think of when you think of the Aga Khan. So they're very different than other Shiites, but nevertheless very critical to the history of this Silk Road region. And first we'll talk about the Hui, the largest. It's an important group to understand because they've been swept up in a lot of the Islamophobia that has been rising in China since 9/11, as it has in many places. But they're also critical because in the early encounter of Chinese with Muslim travelers and immigrants and traders, they called all Muslims Hui. And Islam was called Hui Tiao, the Hui teaching, because that's who they first encountered, people who adopted this term for the Hui, and they adopted and adapted the languages of the Chinese wherever they lived. So in the south, they spoke Cantonese, in the north, Mandarin, Sichuanese, etc. When I moved to Ningxia in 1984, a Hui autonomous region under the Chinese 5 autonomous region system, Xinjiang, Tibet, Ningxia, Inner Mongolia, I was surprised to find that the Hui were spread so far out across China, not just in their own autonomous region, like the Uyghurs. And I was always curious, how did they get there? How did they get so spread out over China? Well, it was the ancient Silk Roads that brought them not only into China, but back out again. And sometimes the Hui are returned as Hui Hui, those who keep returning in Chinese, or Huijia, the Hui families that return. And so they've always had this long history of travel and movement across China. There's a population distribution. You can see that in Xinjiang, there's a large population of Hui, but also in places like Tibet and Hainan Island. And in Beijing, there's 200,000 Hui in Beijing. Those of you who've traveled in China have probably been to the Xi'an Great Mosque. And it was the imam there way back in 1983 when I first visited that explained to me that Hui might look Chinese on the outside like their mosques, but in the inside, they're still very Muslim. And it's this ability of the Hui to pass as Chinese, sometimes as Han. They were often called Han Hui because they could pass as Han. Although Hui today would never claim to be Han, that they are a Hui nationality, a Hui Minzu. But it's really their art, I think, that best illustrates this integration of Chinese culture with Islamic or Middle Eastern culture. Here you see the Quran marvelously reproduced in the characters of show basically longevity and prosperity, not Islamic ideals so much, but very Chinese thinking inscribed in the very words, the very letters of God's language, which is what most Muslims believes, who is the inspired Quran, the inspiration of the Quran. For the Hui, this memory of Islam, of their faith, is critical to their contemporary identity, even though many Hui no longer are secular Hui, are secularized. Some are Marxist, party communist members. And for that, other Muslims are somewhat distrusting. How can you integrate so easily? And the Hui will reply, we are all Muslims, but we're different kinds of Muslims. It's the global ummah, the ideal of Islam, which we found even was adopted by the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs. Now, the Kazakhs also are a Muslim minority in China, but they have a nation state, Kazakhstan. And about 1 million Kazakhs live outside of Kazakhstan in China today. And some people, they're probably disloyal. No, they have not been engaged in much separatism or violence or been accused of terrorism, but they have also been swept up in this re-education camp and this crackdown on the region. As I started out this talk with the story of this woman in the New Yorker. Now, the Kazakhs, we don't have a lot of time to talk about them today, but I do want to mention them not only because of this New Yorker article featured this woman's tragic story, but also because my last field project in Western China was among the Kazakhs. I was part of a team that was supported by the Ford Foundation and other, including the East-West Center, where Miss Turner apparently was a student, and Professor Lampton talked about his introduction to the broader world and the importance of China and East Asia from Miss Turner and her exposure to East-West Center. And I was there for 20 years as a senior fellow. So this project was supported by them, and the Ford Foundation led us, and we had complete permission to work with groups, transnational groups who had communities outside of China. Here I am standing on the border between Afghanistan and China at the entrance to the Wakhan corridor about 11 days before 9/11. Needless to say, I haven't been back, and this project, unfortunately, basically came to an end. At least my participation in the project, although some of the research continues, and you can find out about it if you go to this website and look at, this was the Kazakh woman with whom I worked, and she helped me introduce me to this region of the Kazakhs in northern China, which was still nomadic. About 1/3 of the 1 million Kazakhs in China at that time were still nomadic. And these are some of the records of my traveling with these nomads. And here's a Kazakh woman, very independent, strong-minded, very skilled Kazakh woman, this tradition and that you can see in this New Yorker article, which I highly recommend. If you're interested in this project and my research among these people, you can go to this little YouTube video, watch that, and find out a little bit more about their traditional lifestyle, which they had maintained despite efforts to sedentarize them and transform this traditional lifestyle. It's been under a lot of pressure, a lot of sedentarization of these nomadic Kazakhs. And you could also perhaps take one of my classes on nomadology that I've been teaching here at Pomona College, where now we're doing more online work. So I welcome you to do that. For some reason, and if you have been following this issue, you've found out that the Kazakhs, the reason I talk about them between the Hui and the Uyghur in this presentation, are often caught in the middle of Chinese policy and administration of this region. And here's another tragic story in the New York Times about a Kazakh who was hired to help administer, round up, and report on other Muslim communities in his region, including primarily the target of this policy, the Uyghur. So we'll spend the rest of our time talking about the Uyghur, and I'll try to draw some conclusions in the time that remains. Now, of course, the Uyghur are the largest population in Xinjiang still, in terms of a plurality. It is the Uyghur Autonomous Region. It continues to be named that, although there's been some debate in China about changing the name. It has a very complicated and contested history under Chinese rule that we sought to spell out in this book. And we listed, and we kind of, as one scholar has suggested, this became a somewhat self-fulfilling prophecy, that some of the things that we suggested might happen, such as alienating this large population, has indeed happened. And as a result, this led to my and all the scholars involved in this project being blacklisted from China. And I have not returned to that region. I've had some limited trips to conferences in places like Beijing and Shanghai since that time, but have not been invited back to the region since then. And most of my colleagues, Xinjiang 13, we were called at the time, have not been able to go back. And basically, it's the beginning of a policy of mutual blacklisting and sanctions. Now, this was really heartbreaking for me because I have a long history of engagement with China through my father, who was a hump flyer in World War II. And I was so glad to hear about this important component of the Belt and Road Initiative, which often gets ignored. And that's why USC should be applauded for focusing this conference on the Southeast Asian connection on the road part about the Belt and Road. Most writing has been about the Belt, the overland, the Silk Roads, the ancient Silk Roads, China's relationship with Central Asia and Russia. But this focus on Southeast Asia reminded me so much of what my father's engagement in China, flying back and forth to Kunming. The nexus, the nub of Professor Lampton's talk about the rail networks. Well, those rail networks were disrupted during World War II by the Japanese, their occupation of Southeast Asia and Burma. So it was the air and the overflights that kept China in the war, and basically was recognized as a key component to the end of World War II. My dad was a part of that. He flew 62 missions over the hump. And I grew up with stories about this region and the minorities and the frontiers of China. Then that led to my early fascination with the frontiers of China and its borderlands. But in this book, as I mentioned, that got us all blacklisted, that prevents me now from going back to the region, we tried to suggest that China's policies were important for the history of this region, but they shouldn't go overboard, and they should try to have dialogue and understand some of the regions. Now, what we're seeing with these so-called hidden camps, no longer hidden. China for many years tried to deny it. It started about, I would say, started about 2014 with Xi Jinping's visit to Urumqi, and there was a bombing nearby where he had been speaking. And I think that raised his concern because there'd been a rising number of violence, civil unrest in the region. We scholars on the outside were hesitant to call this terrorism. Here's an excellent map I recommend to you. It's based on low-level LiDAR and also satellite technologies, finding these camps, prisons, and important labor camps as a part of this whole network. And there's been some important reporting on this, mostly from the outside, very difficult to get internal reports, and also those who were former internees in these camps, such as you saw in the New Yorker. But one thing that's not contested in the scholarship is that there was a rising number of Xinjiang and Uyghur-related violence in China. And I think when Xi Jinping visited the region and he had this inspiration of building a legacy of infrastructure connections between China and Central Asia and something, he realized that unless he could squelch these issues, he could not succeed in the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's critical. And we've had some very good documentation of these incidents by several Uyghur-led organizations in DC and elsewhere, talking about not only this huge riot in 2009, which was heavily covered in the Chinese media and opened a lot of Chinese eyes to the problems in the region, which until that time had been rather remote. But as if to drive this problem home to the broader population of Chinese, there was this Jeep attack, a civilian attack car into a crowd. We've seen this elsewhere, such as in Nice in France. Uyghur driver, Eastern Turkestan propaganda or literature in his Jeep, and several people killed civilians. And I think it made this a critical piece in China's efforts to squelch any thoughts of separatism and succession. And I think until this time, when Chinese people were thinking about concerns about the government officials about succession and separatism, they really were focused on Taiwan, maybe Tibet, and of course, Hong Kong. Less so Xinjiang, which they thought was securely held in Chinese hands. But as they looked at what was happening in places like Paris and London and New York after 9/11, I think very much, and I've talked to policymakers, both in China and mostly outside, about this policy, it was very much the idea that we're not going to let this happen in China today. Now, the Uyghurs in the diaspora, about 1 million Uyghurs outside of China, about 10 million inside, have been arguing for a voice, for representation, a seat at the table, and have been strong advocates of a peaceful resolution. The vast majority, and there are many and growing numbers of these Uyghur organizations, do not advocate separatism or independence like the Dalai Lama himself. They argue for peaceful dialogue, peaceful resolution, sovereignty. And they've coordinated with the Tibetan government in exile, and they've set up Uyghur, Eastern Turkestani governments in exile. Unfortunately, however, there are other Uyghurs who are not so supportive of a peaceful resolution. Some of them have joined the global war against any kind of colonial domination of Muslim lands. And this was the main claim of ISIS, to restore a global ummah under one rule, one religion, one government. And Uyghurs were attracted to that, I think not so much in terms of their belief in a global ummah, as some interviews and studies of them have revealed, but for training to do exactly what the Chinese government is afraid of, to become homegrown terrorists, return to China and liberate their homelands. So Uyghur fighters were disproportionately represented among those fighters that were detained after the defeat, mostly defeat of ISIS in the region. And so counterterrorism has been a critical component in China's policy towards the Uyghur. I think it's been, particularly since Xi Jinping's experience in Urumqi, has been the most critical component of this. And in fact, US cooperation with China has been another important component of this. Over 23 Uyghurs in Cuba, in Guantanamo Bay, all since released. Why were they released? Because I think after over 10 years for some of them, interrogation, the US government finally realized they're not separatists from us or terrorists towards us in the West, it's towards China. And we don't detain just any terrorist in Cuba. We're focused on threats to the United States. So all of them have been released, although of course, Gitmo has not been closed down yet, but the Uyghurs have been released. And basically the argument that they were all supporters and members of one organization, which you may have seen a lot of writing about this group known as ETIM. Basically, I think the writing supports this idea of knowledge production and an anti-terrorism industry. Not only does it sell books and support conferences, but huge military projects and programs to develop to sponsor non-state actors sponsored and inspired terrorism. A lot of this, of course, was due to 9/11 and concerns about this kinds of breach of national sovereignty, but also I think has led to a reconfiguring of the region, as well as our own conceptions of the security of the nation state. And in an age and rise of globalization, I think we see that the nation state itself is being called into question, and not just by ISIS, called into questions by multinational corporations such as Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and also these other national, like Huawei, for example. How can they be controlled? Now, there have also been the United Nations, which has not admitted what Ben Anderson called, and Eric Hobsbawm, proto-nations, a lot of these national aspirations, as I started with Joseph Fletcher, are nationalities and nations in waiting, groups of people who want a seat at the table. But the United Nations has not admitted them, and many of them still lack a nation state. But there are other organizations, such as UNPO, unrecognized nations and peoples organization based in The Hague, in which the Uyghurs and Tibetans, Hawaiians, Native Americans, and other peoples participate. So I'm probably running out of time when I see Clay's smiling face. So I'm going to probably stop here.